My name is Harper Lane, and if there's one thing I've learned in life, it's that not all strength is loud. Some of the strongest people walk softly, carry kindness in their hands, and let their work speak volumes while they stay silent. That's who I am. I've never been the one to elbow my way to the front of the room or scream for recognition. I believed, no, I knew, that when you do meaningful work, people eventually see it. Or so I thought. For nearly 6 years, I dedicated myself to Voxtel Communications, an accessibility tech company known for building bridges between people and technology. I wasn't just another name in the payroll system. I was their lead ASL interpreter, a liaison between our company and clients who couldn't hear but had every right to be heard. I worked directly with product teams, legal staff, international partners, and, most importantly, our clients from the deaf and hard of hearing community. My skill set wasn't just technical, it was personal. My older brother Noah lost his hearing when he was just 15. A freak sports accident, a foul ball straight to the temple. One moment, he was laughing with me in the stands. The next, we were in a hospital room, doctors explaining that some losses don't heal. That night, while Noah cried silently in his hospital bed, I promised myself I'd learn to speak his new language. And I did. I became fluent in American Sign Language, not because someone paid me, but because someone I loved needed me. Years later, that skill would define my career. I didn't just interpret, I connected. I translated emotion, context, sarcasm, frustration, laughter, all the things computers still struggle to get right. I wasn't a tool. I was a human bridge between two worlds. And for a while, at Voxtel, that meant something. The former CEO, Mr. Garrett, understood that. He saw the impact of real inclusion. He knew our company's value was more than profit. It was purpose. But nothing gold ever stays. When Mr. Garrett retired, a new name rolled into town. Blake Rourke, a so-called visionary, fresh out of Silicon Valley with a disrupt everything mindset and a LinkedIn page that read like a Wall Street fantasy. He was the type who wore $800 shoes and talked about cutting the fat in meetings filled with people who'd worked their fingers to the bone. We all felt the shift the day he arrived. The hallway chatter went silent. The culture grew colder. People started watching their backs. I remember our first meeting like it was yesterday. He called a mandatory staff briefing, stood at the front of the room like he was hosting a TED Talk, and started rattling off KPIs, margins, and projections like we were machines, not people. When it was my turn to introduce myself, I kept it short. Harper Lane, lead interpreter, accessibility consultant, 6 years. His eyes skimmed over me like I was an afterthought. Then he chuckled, tilted his head, and said, "Harper, nice resume, but let's be real. Interpreting? Isn't AI doing that now?" The room got quiet. My face didn't flinch, but something cracked inside. Not because I was insulted. I've dealt with ignorance before. But because I could tell this man didn't care to learn. He didn't want to understand what I did. To him, my job wasn't scalable, so it wasn't valuable. He saw data, not people, charts, not change. And he certainly didn't see me. But what he didn't realize was that I had been in rooms where deals were saved because I could sign fast enough to keep up with a frustrated deaf executive. I'd helped design features that revolutionized our interface for disabled users, making it more human, more intuitive. I was the reason 2 of our biggest clients renewed for another 3 years. And yet, I sat there being talked down to by a man who thought he could replace empathy with code. He didn't just underestimate me. He erased me. From that day on, I could feel the shift. Fewer emails, excluded from high-level meetings, my ideas left off the strategy board. It was clear. Blake didn't see accessibility as innovation. He saw it as overhead. And people like me, we were just extras. I went home that night and cried. Not because I was scared of being fired, but because I knew that what we had built, the inclusive culture we fought for, was dying under a man who didn't believe in it. But here's the thing. When someone pushes you into the shadows, you don't disappear. You grow quieter, smarter, stronger. I knew then that my silence wasn't weakness. It was strategy. Because people like Blake, they only hear when it's already too late, and I was about to become the loudest silence he'd ever hear. 2 months had barely passed since Blake Rourke took over as CEO, but the atmosphere at Voxtel had changed so drastically that I barely recognized the place I once called my professional home. The halls that used to buzz with quiet collaboration and shared purpose were now heavy with tension and unspoken fear. People moved like ghosts, eyes darting nervously. Conversations cut short as whispers spread like wildfire about impending layoffs and departmental restructurings. The company that had prided itself on accessibility and inclusion was now caught in the grip of cold corporate efficiency, where value was only measured by profit margins and how fast a role could be replaced. I watched, helpless, as the teams I had helped build, nurtured, and relied on began to crumble under the weight of Blake's ruthless streamlining. Friends who had been pillars of the company, who had dedicated years of their lives, were being told their titles no longer existed, their roles erased with no explanation other than they were no longer aligned with the company's future vision. The words, delivered in a quarterly all-hands meeting, felt like daggers piercing my heart. Blake stood at the front of the room with his usual smug expression, a man who believed he was remaking the world in his image, oblivious to the damage he was causing to people's lives. "We're streamlining," he said coldly, his voice void of empathy. "Some support roles are no longer aligned with the company's future vision." The room was so still, you could hear a pin drop. I sat there, stunned, but determined to stay composed. Surely, I was safe. After all, who else in this company spoke fluent ASL? Who else truly understood our hearing-impaired clients' needs? Who else was the bridge in so many crucial negotiations? But then, just a week later, the truth came crashing down on me. I was called into HR, the dreaded meeting no one ever wants. The woman behind the desk looked uncomfortable, shuffling papers as she read the words that would unravel my world. "We regret to inform you." Her voice was flat, rehearsed, void of any compassion. I was fired. No warning, no chance to fight for my position. No recognition of my years of dedication or the difference I'd made. No severance, no farewell. Just a cold handshake and a security escort out of the building like a criminal rather than a valued employee. The shock and betrayal hit me like a freight train. How could they do this? Why? Because I wasn't flashy enough? Because my work didn't generate fast profits? Because I didn't have an MBA or a fancy title? They failed to see that what I did wasn't just a support role. It was the heart and soul of accessibility at Voxtel. I was the one who made sure our technology actually worked for people like my brother Noah, who deserved more than just lip service from a company claiming to value inclusion. I had stayed late countless nights, working hand in hand with developers to create features that transformed lives. I had mediated complex negotiations where a simple misunderstanding could have cost millions. I was invisible to them, a casualty of Blake's cost-cutting crusade. But I wasn't invisible to the clients who depended on me. And more importantly, I wasn't invisible to myself. I left that building not broken, but burning with a quiet fire. Because mistakes like this don't just vanish. They echo. They ripple through companies and communities until they cannot be ignored. Blake had made a grave mistake, one that would come back to haunt him in ways he never imagined. I wasn't just going to fade away. I was going to rise, louder and stronger than ever. This was not the end of my story. It was the prologue to a reckoning that would expose the hollowness of Blake's leadership and the real cost of ignoring the human element in business. I carried with me the voices of the voiceless, the trust of the clients, and the lessons from my brother's silent struggle. I was ready to fight, not just for myself, but for everyone who had been cast aside by a system that valued profit over people. I was cut from the team I had helped hold together, but I was far from defeated. This was my moment to transform pain into power, invisibility into impact, and silence into a voice that no one would ever be able to ignore again. 3 months had passed since I was unceremoniously cut loose from Voxtel Communications, the place I had given 6 years of my life, the company I had helped grow and shape, and the one that had thrown me away without a second thought. At first, the sting of betrayal was sharp and raw. I remember the silence that followed my firing, the hollow echo of footsteps as I left the building for the last time, security guard trailing behind like I was a criminal rather than a dedicated employee. But after the initial shock faded, I found a new path: freelancing. Suddenly, I was my own boss, free to choose projects that mattered, work with clients who actually valued my skills and the cause I stood for. It was invigorating, liberating even. But deep down, the wound was still there, a constant reminder of how easily people who don't understand your worth can erase you. I built a modest but steady clientele, mostly small businesses and nonprofits eager to improve accessibility and communication. I worked tirelessly, pouring every ounce of passion and professionalism into my work. I was rebuilding my life, brick by brick, signing for people who needed me, connecting with a community that I loved and that loved me back. Then, one afternoon, my phone rang. An unknown number flashed on the screen. I hesitated. My heart thudded in my chest. Was this a coincidence or a message from the past? I answered. The voice on the other end was familiar, chilling in its cold politeness. Harper Lane, this is Blake Rourke. We need your help, urgently. I closed my eyes, a bitter smile creeping across my face. The man who had dismissed me, who had cast me aside like an inconvenience, was now calling me back. The irony wasn't lost on me. I waited for him to explain. He told me about a massive $30 million contract Voxtel had secured with Kenta Masuda, a legendary Japanese-American tech mogul who was deaf. Kenta's business was booming, and this deal was critical for Voxtel's future. But Kenta insisted on in-person ASL communication for all negotiations. And here was the punchline. Voxtel had no one left who could do it. I almost laughed aloud. How could they have gotten themselves into this mess? I was their only ASL specialist, the person who had been their voice for years. I asked Blake directly, my voice calm but loaded with disbelief. You fired your only ASL specialist, and now you want her back? Silence fell for a moment. Then, his tone darkened with desperation. This is bigger than pride, Harper. We can't afford to lose this deal. I held back a chuckle, my confidence surging. Then you'll pay like it's bigger than pride. The power dynamic had shifted. I was no longer a disposable employee. I was a professional with leverage, and I wasn't going to let Blake off easy. Terms were negotiated. I refused to come back as a full-time employee. I was a freelancer now, and I demanded respect, fair pay, and control over how I worked. Blake, hungry to save his deal, agreed without hesitation. When I stepped back into Voxtel's office, it was like walking into a battlefield. The familiar faces looked at me differently, some with surprise, some with envy, and some with quiet admiration. I was no longer the woman they overlooked. I was the woman they needed. The pressure was enormous. Negotiations with Kenta Masuda were delicate and fast-moving. Every sign, every facial expression, every subtle movement had to be flawless. I was more than an interpreter. I was a bridge between two worlds, a conduit for trust and understanding. Kenta's sharp gaze and slight nods told me I was succeeding. Behind the scenes, Blake watched, his usual smugness replaced by grudging respect. He realized he had underestimated me, the human element I brought that no AI or corporate strategy could replace. After the deal was closed successfully, Blake invited me into his office. I saw the flicker of hesitation in his eyes. He was silently acknowledging his mistake, but too proud to say it aloud. I met his gaze and said firmly, "Next time, don't forget who makes your business human." That sentence carried the weight of every overlooked employee, every unheard voice, and every silent battle fought by people like me. Walking out of that office, I felt a surge of victory and closure. Revenge isn't about petty spite. It's about reclaiming your dignity and power, standing tall in the face of injustice, and showing that your worth cannot be erased. Voxtel had tried to silence me, but I returned on my own terms, changing the game forever. This wasn't just my personal victory. It was a message to every company that thinks profit trumps people. The quiet ones, the invisible workers, are the backbone of any successful business, and their silence is only temporary. Sometimes, silence hides a storm waiting to break free, and when it does, it's unstoppable. This chapter of my life taught me that true strength lies in resilience, authenticity, and self-respect. I was done being invisible. I was done being undervalued. I was here, and I was powerful. I walked into the towering glass building of Voxtel Communications, with a storm brewing beneath my calm exterior. Every step echoing a silent but fierce declaration that I was back, not as the overlooked interpreter, but as a force that would not be ignored or erased. The sterile, cold air inside felt like a test, as if the building itself was trying to intimidate me. But I was beyond fear. I was fueled by months of pain, humiliation, and the burning fire of vindication. Blake Rourke, the man who had fired me without a second thought, sat behind the gleaming boardroom table, his usual cocky demeanor replaced by a flicker of uncertainty as our eyes locked. I didn't waste time with greetings or small talk. "Before I sit down," I said firmly, sliding a contract across the table, "here are my conditions. I return as an independent contractor with no strings attached, and my salary is double what it was before. Every accessibility initiative I lead will bear my exclusive credit, no exceptions, and you will issue a public statement admitting your mistake in firing me." The room was heavy with silence, the kind that screams louder than words. Blake's eyes widened in disbelief. "You're serious?" he asked, voice low, nearly cracking. "Deadly serious," I answered, holding his gaze steady, letting the power of my conviction fill the space between us. His fingers trembled slightly as he picked up the contract, scanning the terms that flipped the script on his arrogance and desperation. This moment was his reckoning. Pride swallowed by the need to save a contract he had just jeopardized. After a pause, heavy with tension, he signed. The ink sealed more than a business agreement. It marked the rebirth of a woman who refused to be invisible any longer. Leaving the boardroom, I felt a rush of power surge through me, but I knew the real challenge awaited: the meeting with Kenta Masuda. Kenta was no ordinary client. He was a tech mogul, deaf, with a vision for inclusive communication, and he had been betrayed by Voxtel's reckless decision to fire the very person who could speak his language. The minimalist conference room felt like a sanctuary as I entered, greeted by Kenta's intense but warm eyes. We communicated in ASL, fingers dancing with meaning, expressions painting emotions that transcended spoken language. His disappointment in Voxtel's leadership was raw and heartfelt. He signed how firing me shattered his trust and threatened the $30 million deal. Yet within his signs was a glimmer of hope, a desire to build a future where accessibility was not an afterthought, but a priority, and a belief that I was the person to lead that charge. The weight of his trust was immense, and I accepted it with a solemn promise to not just interpret, but to be a true partner in change. Days later, the news came. Kenta had withdrawn the contract from Voxtel and awarded it directly to me. I was entrusted with leading his U.S. expansion in inclusive communications, a role that was more than a job. It was a mission. Alone in my apartment that night, city lights flickering through the window like distant stars, I reflected on my journey, the pain of betrayal, the sting of invisibility, and the fierce joy of reclaiming my voice. This was no petty revenge. It was a triumph of dignity, resilience, and unwavering self-worth. I vowed never to let anyone diminish my value again. My work would not only elevate me, but amplify the voices of those who had been silenced or overlooked. Blake's mistake was emblematic of a corporate culture blinded by greed and short-term gains. But I had rewritten the narrative. I was no longer a background player. I was the leader, the catalyst, the storm that would reshape how the world viewed accessibility and inclusion. Every signed contract, every project I led, every barrier I broke was a statement. Underestimate me, and you lose far more than you imagine. My silence had not been weakness. It was the calm before a storm that would change everything. This chapter of my life was not just about me. It was about every person marginalized and dismissed, every voice ignored. I was their champion, their proof that true power comes from persistence, passion, and unyielding belief in your worth. I stepped forward with strength that could not be shaken, resilience forged from pain, and a vision for a future where inclusion was not negotiable but essential. I was ready to show the world that sometimes the quietest voices carry the fiercest storms, and when those storms break free, they are unstoppable and transformative. This was my stage, my terms, and my victory. After my triumphant return to the industry, the ripples of change spread far beyond what anyone at Voxtel could have imagined. Their stock price began a slow and steady decline, a visible sign of the internal turmoil and lost faith from investors who saw the company falter without its most valuable asset. Blake Rourke, who once strutted through those glass corridors with his inflated ego and misplaced confidence, now faced the harsh reality that his decisions had cost the company dearly. The board members, who had previously applauded his aggressive cost-cutting and image-first strategies, found themselves scrambling to contain the fallout of his miscalculations. Rumors of his removal began to circulate like wildfire, and eventually, the official announcement came. Blake was ousted for what the company delicately termed strategic misjudgment, a phrase that barely masked the catastrophic errors in judgment that had led to plummeting morale, broken client relationships, and millions of lost dollars. Meanwhile, my life was taking a dramatically different path. I had transitioned from being the quiet, invisible employee to the shining beacon of change, the face of a groundbreaking partnership that championed inclusivity, accessibility, and true innovation. I didn't need to raise my voice or stage a fiery confrontation. I let my work speak volumes, louder than any shout ever could. The irony was palpable. The company that had dismissed me for being non-essential now watched as I became the leading force in the tech world's most people-centered, progressive communications initiative. Clients who once bypassed me now sought my expertise, and the community I had served quietly for years rallied behind me, their support unwavering and powerful. I saw the regret creep into the conversations behind closed doors at Voxtel, a slow realization that the decision to cut me had been a fatal error. Every lost contract, every damaged partnership was a painful reminder to them of what they had thrown away in the name of misguided corporate ambition. But I never gloated. I held my head high, knowing that true victory was not measured by tearing others down, but by rising through unwavering self-belief and integrity. My success became a message to all those who had been overlooked and underestimated, that invisibility is not weakness, but often the quietest form of strength. I built a legacy not on revenge, but on resilience and relentless dedication to my mission. The very company that had cast me aside was now a case study in how ignoring the human element of business can lead to downfall. I spearheaded initiatives that transformed communication for the deaf and hard-of-hearing community, pushing boundaries in technology and corporate culture. Each project was a testament to the power of inclusion, a stark contrast to the short-sightedness I had endured. Blake's fall from grace was swift and absolute, a cautionary tale whispered in boardrooms and conferences, a reminder that leadership demands respect for people, not just profits. Watching it all unfold, I understood that my silence in those early days was not emptiness, but the calm before a storm of change that I was destined to lead. The sound of justice was not loud or violent. It was the profound echo of truth and fairness resonating through every corner of the industry. This chapter of my life closed not with bitterness, but with a powerful truth, that everyone deserves to be seen, heard, and valued for who they are and what they bring. I had waited patiently while others underestimated me, and when the moment came, my quiet strength became an unstoppable force. The world learned that sometimes the loudest scream comes from the silence of those who refused to be erased. The lesson was clear. Don't mistake invisibility for weakness, because the quietest voices often carry the fiercest storms within. My journey was more than personal vindication. It was a beacon of hope and change for anyone who had ever been sidelined or silenced. I had become proof that integrity, passion, and resilience could rewrite the narrative, transforming pain into power and invisibility into influence. The regret that hung over Voxtel was a sound that no apology could drown out, a reminder that true leadership is built on respect, inclusion, and the courage to see beyond the surface. And in the end, as I stood at the forefront of a movement that would change lives and industries, I realized something profound. Justice doesn't always need to shout to be heard. Sometimes it is the quiet, unwavering conviction that resonates the longest and the loudest, echoing far beyond the walls that tried to confine it. And trust me, when regret finally finds its voice, it screams louder than anything you've ever heard. But my story wasn't just about personal triumph or corporate downfall. It was about shifting an entire paradigm. It was about challenging the status quo and forcing industries to reconsider who they value and why. Every presentation I gave, every strategy I developed, carried the weight of those who had been pushed aside in silence for far too long. I became more than a consultant or an interpreter. I was a movement incarnate. The tech world, often cold and calculated, suddenly found itself confronting the human side it had long ignored. Boardrooms that once dismissed accessibility as a checkbox now invited me to speak at conferences and advisory panels, hungry to learn how to truly embrace diversity and inclusion. That was my victory, turning pain and rejection into a platform for real, lasting change. But this transformation didn't come without sacrifice. I had to shed old versions of myself, the quiet employee who hid her light to avoid conflict. I embraced my voice, my worth, and my power unapologetically. I learned to navigate the complexities of leadership with grace and tenacity, often standing alone, but never wavering. The silence I once bore like a weight now became a weapon and a shield, a testament to the strength found in resilience. The message I carried forward was simple but revolutionary. Every person deserves recognition, respect, and the chance to shine, no matter how invisible they might feel. And so, as I stood on the cusp of a new era in inclusive communication, I knew this wasn't the end of my journey, but a new beginning, a call to all who had been silenced to raise their hands, lift their voices, and demand the respect they deserved. My story was a beacon of hope, a reminder that justice, no matter how silent it starts, always finds a way to be heard, clear and unmistakable, echoing through time and change.